For those of you that are already with us or slowly joining us, just to say that we'd like to give you a warm welcome. We are just going to wait for 1 or 2 minutes more before we start the session. In the meantime, please note that for this webinar, if you do want to pose questions or comments, you're welcome to use the chat function. And there will be a Q&A session later on, but I will be giving instructions when we're ready to start. So a warm welcome to participants that are joining already. Okay, well, perhaps we can get started now. We have an interesting discussion ahead of us today, and I want to make sure that we're able to use our discussion well today. I just would like to say that we are going to be pulling up a poll before we get this conversation started today. As you know, this is a webinar on COVID-19. Are we getting the balance right? We would like to ask participants to already sort of post answers to the poll that is on your screen right now. And the questions, I'll just read them out very quickly. What drew you to today's webinar, Mandela Talk, on balancing rights in the time of COVID-19? And the answers are either A, I am inspired by Nelson Mandela and want to be part of an event celebrating his legacy. B, I am an academic researcher and this is a field of interest to me. C, I work in civil society and this is a field of interest to me for my work. D, I work in a governmental institution and this is a field of interest to me for my work. I am a student alumni of the Center for Human Rights. I have attended a previous Center for Human Rights talk or discussion forum event. I have an interest in the constitutionality of lockdown regulations in South Africa. I know very little about constitutionality of the lockdown regulations in South Africa. I know very little about the constitution of the lockdown regulations in South Africa. So that's the first question. And the second one is, has South African government struck the right balance in the response to COVID-19? And here we are asking you to choose one answer. The answers are either yes, definitely, not quite, definitely not, I am not sure. And the third question that we have, just to get us started today, is do you agree the South African response to COVID-19 has been guided by a constitutional framework highlighting the values of accountability, transparency, and justification? And there you have the option of being able to respond either A, yes, definitely, B, not quite, C, definitely not, or D, I am not sure. So we would all ask if you could just take a minute to respond to some of those questions. And then before we really kickstart our panel discussion, we will all have a look and see what the responses to those 3 poll questions have been. So to get us started, I will just give a couple of instructions. We will ask the panelists and the people doing the welcome today to keep their cameras off, but we will ask all fellow participants in the meeting today to keep their cameras off so that we don't overcharge our system. We will also automatically put people on mute during our deliberations today so that we ensure that there are no disruptions. But during the Q&A session, there is an opportunity for you to raise your hands. We will take a combination of either making comments in the chat function or asking questions in the chat function, and having maybe an opportunity to also give a chance to some people to to take the floor and ask some of their questions so that we can hear their voices as well. So with that, and some of the more, introductory aspects, I would just like to really warmly welcome everybody again today, both all our participants and our esteemed panelists. My name is Abigail Nuku. I am the regional representative for Southern Africa at the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and I will be chairing this Mandela Talk today. I would really like to begin by thanking the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria, the Leading Like Mandela Institute, and the Thembekile Mandela Foundation for bringing us together for this important conversation in this July Mandela Month. Tata Madiba, as he was known affectionately, would have been 102 years this month, and it's an honor to pay tribute to an extraordinary person of moral conscience and a global leader. Of course, we meet today when we just learned of the passing of anti-apartheid struggle stalwart Andrew Mhlangeni, the last surviving Rivonia trialist. We pay tribute to him, to the immense contribution that he made to the liberation of this country, and express our deepest condolences to his family and loved ones. Dear friends and participants, the theme of our discussion today is centered on whether we are getting the balance right in the context of COVID-19. I believe this is a topical discussion on a complex matter centered on the best ways to approach the constitutional implications of COVID-19 regulatory framework. Some of the critical questions that we must confront are: how should contending claims of restrictions on rights versus realizing rights be balanced? What has been the approach of the courts to this? Have the courts adopted the right approach in the context of the pandemic? Are there issues related to the pandemic that should not be dealt with by the courts and instead be dealt with administrators or the legislature? As the United Nations Secretary General said during his Nelson Mandela lecture this past weekend, COVID-19 is shining a light on injustice. Growing gaps in trust between people, institutions, and leaders threaten us all. People want their human rights and fundamental freedoms to be respected. They also want a say in decisions that affect their lives. Colleagues, friends, and fellow participants, these are some of the vital questions that are bringing us into conversation today. They are both timely and relevant, and we have esteemed panelists to lead us in this discussion. So for today's Mandela Talk, we have a maximum of 2 hours. We will complete and end the session by 1 p.m. and we will start with introductory remarks by our hosts today, and then proceed to presentations from our esteemed panelists, whom I will introduce in a few minutes. This will be followed by questions and reflections by participants. We will take the questions, as I've already said, by either raising your hand or using the chat function. Please note that this webinar is also being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. So without further ado, and to get us started, I would like to invite Professor Frans Viljoen, who is the director at the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria, to say a few words of welcome as we begin this webinar. Prof, over to you.
Thank you very much, Abigail, and welcome to everyone from my side as well. I just want to say a few words of thanks and say a few words about the aim of this event. So my thanks first to Abigail for also agreeing to be with us, from ROSA, that lovely acronym, the Regional Office, Southern Africa of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. We really appreciate. And then to Dr. Azam from the Leading Like Mandela Institute at the Thembekile Mandela Foundation. We really are glad to be working with you. Thank you for initiating and working so seamlessly with us in the organization of this event. This is really part of the Center's commemoration, remembering of our great Madiba in this Mandela Month. I associate myself with the remarks made by our chair, and also extend our condolences, remembering the passing of Zinzi Mandela also in this time. So in terms of the event, I think it is clear that the coronavirus is, in a sense, in the first place, a challenge to our health. Our worlds have become permeated by data and statistics that are health related. And many people have pointed out that overnight, many of us have become public health experts and epidemiologists of note. But more fundamentally, and at another level, the COVID-19 is a challenge to our constitutionality, our values of constitutionalism. And that is so due to the lockdown regulations that have come in various forms and shapes. And concomitantly, I think much of the discourse surrounding us pertain to issues around cases, constitutional values, and we could also say that overnight many around us have become constitutional experts. So the aim of today's webinar, I think, is in a sense to give a platform to the real constitutional experts, our wonderfully constituted panel, to reflect together with us on the issues pertaining to the questions Abigail posed, namely, have we struck the balance right? How do we need to understand limitation of rights in this particular context? And I think there is a lot of noise, a lot of discussion around us, but the aim today really is to say, how do we, and could we try to, in a sense, separate the chaff from the grain, the substance from the fluff. And to that end, I really thank our 4 panelists, 2 justices, former judges of the Constitutional Court, member of the South African Human Rights Commission, a practicing attorney. They will, together with us, I think the audience, try to make sense and give an understanding, and maybe advance our thinking and charting a course through this very complex field that we find ourselves in. So thanks really from my side to everyone participating, all the members of the audience, wherever you are, and to our panelists. And with these few words, I wish us all fruitful deliberations. And once again, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Prof, and also for your continued and unwavering commitment to human rights over so many years. I'd now like to hand it over to Mr. Liaqat Azam, who is the director of the Leading Like Mandela Institute, to really locate our discussion today and introduce the concept really behind the Mandela Talks. Mr. Azam, if I could ask you, what do you expect from this talk, and what is really truly the inspiration behind it? I think you're on mute.
Yeah, here we go. Good morning to our esteemed panelists, to our viewers out there, to all South Africans and people around the world who are joining us today. Firstly, during this month of the birth, where we recognize the birth of one of the world's greatest human rights activists and leaders, Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela. And we have also been, last week we met the news, this tragic news of the loss of another great activist and the daughter of Nelson Mandela, Ambassador Zinzi Mandela. And I would also like to pay tribute this morning to Baba Mlangeni, one of the Rivonia trialists, and who had served his time at Robben Island as well with Nelson Mandela, and who stood for human rights. And so essentially today's Mandela Talk and the background of Leading Like Mandela and the Mandela Talks. When we launched the program, Leading Like Mandela, it was a conversation I had with Nelson Mandela at his home in Kunu, in continuing his legacy, and specifically in leadership. Because leadership is critical for, as we know, for us to attain the ideals of what the aspirations and the vision of the Freedom Charter and our Constitution. For that, we require effective governance, and effective governance is based on effective leadership. Nelson Mandela showed us the power of a great leader, what one human being could do to impact the world. So Leading Like Mandela was then conceptualized, and we then officially launched in the centenary year with, in partnership with the United Nations. We had Ms. Amina Mohammed, the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, delivering her address, where she mentioned that the Leading Like Mandela and the Mandela Talks, where she spoke about the importance for, that the future of the world to be decided by not just a few, and that each one of us has a role and a responsibility towards the future of the world and to improving the conditions that we find ourselves in. So I find, as you said, it's very timely, recognizing the need on at this time during the month of Nelson Mandela, when the world is also facing one of the great pandemics, which has also been called the triple pandemic, because of the effect it's having on the economy and the social well-being of people. As the Secretary General of the UN has also stated in his when he delivered the annual Nelson Mandela lecture on Mandela Day, that this brings into sharp focus. COVID-19 has brought into sharp focus the inadequacies in the global systems of governance, the systems of health, access to healthcare, the basic rights, human rights that we have, stated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. How this has impacted people's ability to access effective healthcare, education, to be able to economic growth and to be able to participate in the economy effectively. So this talk comes at a time, and it is a series. So Mandela Talks is a series of dialogues which we then launched as part of the Leading Like Mandela Leadership Development Program, which is to promote active citizenry. It's for us to participate in the development of our world. And I'd like to begin with a quote by Nelson Mandela, given in memory of Nelson Mandela and Baba Mlangeni, who were the Rivonia trialists and who sacrificed, and what did they stand for? And they have now passed and they've handed the baton over to us as citizens. What do we do, or how do we take this forward? When Nelson Mandela said, "I have dedicated myself to the struggle of the African people. I fought against white domination and I fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all people and all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve, but if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." And this sets the tone and the basis of our talk today. What is that vision that Nelson Mandela and the founding fathers and mothers of our great democracy, what was their vision, and where are we in terms of that as a nation? How do we then play a role, either as civil society, as academics, public sector and private sector, all parts of society coming together to be able to contribute, because with rights also comes responsibility. What are those responsibilities, and how do we as individuals stand up to that? And as we remember Baba Mlangeni today, I recall when he launched his book, we were with him, and he said that we have squandered our freedom. He was very disappointed. He said, "We have squandered the freedom for which we have sacrificed our life for." And because freedom without, when we look at what was the vision of freedom, and then the freedom, what did it mean for Nelson Mandela and for these great leaders? We had sacrificed everything they had for us to achieve this and attain this as a nation. Freedom meant equal opportunities for people to live in dignity, equality, access to effective healthcare, education, and to be able to participate in the economy as equal citizens. As you've mentioned, COVID-19 has brought these disparities and inequalities into sharp focus. So today's talk essentially focuses a series of dialogues, because the Leading Like Mandela and the Mandela Talks will then work with various think tanks and within government and the United Nations and various academic institutions, where we could then influence policy, and how do we then take that forward. Abigail, in terms of the Constitution, I'd also like, when we talk about the preamble to our Constitution states that we, the people of South Africa, recognize the injustice of the past. We honor those who suffered for justice and freedom in our land. and all the more so today on the passing of Baba Mlangeni, and the fact that it's Mandela Month, and also the passing of Zinzi Mandela. And how do we honor those who have suffered for justice and freedom in our land? We respect those who have worked to build and develop our country. We believe that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, united in our diversity. It goes on further to say we heal the divisions of the past and establish a society based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. This is what we are questioning today. How have our human rights been impacted, and what will we do as a country, as the world, to come together? How do we improve? It also meant to say we should improve the quality of life of all citizens, build a united and democratic South Africa. How do we continue to do that? Because currently our constitutional democracy is under major threat. All these deficiencies have been brought to light. How do we then continue to support and to develop upon the great work that was performed by our founding fathers and mothers of the country? So in getting the balance right, remember, whilst we are talking specifically around the balance regarding COVID and the impact that it has in terms of our human rights and our freedom, it is also bringing into great, as we said, perspective, what are the underlying causes? Whilst we address the effects of and the impact of COVID-19, what are the underlying and root causes that has caused a breakdown in the ideals and the vision that we have in terms of our constitution, our freedom charter, and the ideals that Nelson Mandela and the others and founding fathers and mothers have stood for. But that really sets the tone for today's discussion. A matter, given that the economy is also being impacted, people's access, how do we improve ethical leadership in the country? That resources are being utilized more effectively. How does each one of us stand up? Because we often say, sometimes we look out at the conditions of the world and people will say, but what can I do? And I'm saying, Nelson Mandela has shown us what one man can do. So the power is in your hands and the responsibility is with you. And as we release ourselves from, COVID has also shown that we are under lockdown. It's shown us how our freedom, that our freedom fighters have stood for, how our freedom has been impaired. And it's time for us to liberate ourselves once again, to tap into the power that lies within us by drawing on the inspiration and the legacies of these great leaders, so that we may be transformed as we release ourselves from these lockdowns, set ourselves free, and our freedom and our example should liberate the people whose lives we are fortunate to touch. Thank you, Abigail.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Azam, for bringing us together, I should say, and challenging us all to really lead like Mandela. You've given us inspiration from some of the things that Mandela himself has said, and you've also reminded us of some of the very vital preambular paragraphs of the Constitution of this country, and reminded us also that each one of us has a really important role to contribute to active citizenship. So before we get to the panel, I think maybe let's have a look at our poll results. I'm seeing that if I can just read them out, the results to our first question, which was what drew you to today's webinar, Mandela Talk and Balancing Rights at the Time of COVID-19. It seems like most of the participants are joining today because they have an interest in constitutionality of the lockdown regulations. So that is what is scored at the highest. But also I would say that a near contender is also the fact that people feel that they are inspired by Nelson Mandela and want to be part of an event that is celebrating his legacy. So I think that's the first poll result in terms of the first question. And then in terms of the second question, which was, has the South African government struck the right balance in its response to COVID-19? I think it looks like the majority of our participants believe that perhaps not quite. And then, you know, a close contender there would also be that some participants are not sure. So we have 44% who feel that they have not quite struck the right balance, and 41% who feel that they're not really quite sure. So I think that's what makes this conversation even more interesting. And then for the third question, which was, do you agree the South African response to COVID-19 has been guided by the constitutional framework, highlighting the values of accountability, transparency, and justification? Again, there we have the majority of participants, 44%, who feel that not quite. And a close contender there, I would say, is I'm not sure, again, at 30%. So there we have it, our first poll results. We will also be doing another poll before the end of our panel discussion today. But I think, you know, those results are really pointing to the fact that it's a really timely conversation that we are having today. So I think it's time that we hear from our esteemed panelists, and I'll begin by introducing them and then giving them the floor. I'll introduce all of them first, just very brief introductions. All of them, as you know, would require a very lengthy introduction, but really in the interest of time, I will try to just make it brief. So today we have Justice Johann van der Westhuizen, who is the retired judge of the Constitutional Court of South Africa, former judge of the North Gauteng High Court, former professor of law at the faculty of the University of Pretoria, founding director of the Center for Human Rights, and was also a member of the independent panel of recognized constitutional experts assisting the Constitutional Assembly in drafting of the Constitution. Justice van der Westhuizen, a warm welcome to you, and thank you so much for being with us. Then we also have Justice Zak Yaqub, who is also a retired judge of the Constitutional Court of South Africa, and was one of the panel of experts appointed by the Constitutional Assembly to advise on the final constitution. He has taken a very keen interest in the enforcement of socioeconomic rights and served as a commissioner of the Independent Electoral Commission that managed the first democratic elections in South Africa in 1994. He helped organize and mobilize for democracy as a member of the ANC Underground and an official of the United Democratic Front. He is blind since infancy and has served blind empowerment organizations nationally and locally. Justice Yaqub, a very warm welcome to you, and thank you so much for being with us. Then we have Advocate Mohammed Shafi Amirmir, who was a commissioner at the South African Human Rights Commission, where his focus has been on the right to housing, water and sanitation, business and human rights. Prior to his appointment to the commission, Advocate Amirmir advised the Limpopo provincial government on legal and related socio-economic rights matters, where he served in various senior executive managerial capacities. He was also town secretary of the Makado municipality in Limpopo and executive member of the board convocation of the University of Wits. He currently serves on a number of professional bodies. And finally, but by far the least, we have Ms. Okyerebea Ampofo-Anti, who is an attorney and the founder of Ampofo-Anti Consulting. She is a data protection, media law, and dispute resolution specialist with 13 years of experience as a legal practitioner. She has represented and advised both local and international clients across multiple sectors. Ms. Ampofo-Anti began her career as a law clerk to the late Chief Justice Pius Langa at the Constitutional Court of South Africa, and worked with one of South Africa's top-tier law firms, Weber Wenzel, where she spent over a decade and became a partner in dispute resolution practice. She has a keen interest in academia and has published widely, and is also, I should add, an alumni of the University of Pretoria. So welcome to all of you. Welcome, Ms. Okyerebea, welcome, Commissioner, welcome, Justice Yaqub and Justice Westhuizen. It's really an honor to have all of you with us today. I will be giving them each 10 minutes to make a presentation based on a number of questions that I will put up to them. So first up, I would like to ask Justice van der Westhuizen to start by really laying the foundation for our discussion today. As some have said, Professor Frans Viljoen described it, there's a lot of noise around this topic at the moment. Help us understand a little bit or unpack that noise. What is really at stake in considering the appropriate balance between realizing rights and limiting rights in a public health emergency? I think that would be really, really helpful for us if you could sort of unpack the sort of normative constitutional elements to much of the debates that are unfolding right now. Justice, over to you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. It is an honor to be here. The reason why the basic introduction was allocated to me, and it will be quite basic because I was told that to remember that the audience are not lawyers specifically. So the introduction is fairly basic, but the reason why I also accepted the task of introducing is because I know the questions about the weighing. I know how complicated the questions are, but I have no idea what the answer is. So I will start, and I look forward to hearing answers from the other participants. Of course, we are a constitutional democracy. That means that our constitution has a Bill of Rights, Chapter 2, but it also means that the courts can test legislation and executive action. So we do not have parliamentary sovereignty. Legislation can be tested. Linked to that is how political is this process. Now, on the one hand, we know that constitutional jurisprudence always is political. It has political implications. Concepts like equality, etc., are to some extent political. However, courts should not be involved in politics. Why do we have around 100 or whatever, later speakers will tell us, cases at the moment pending or about to be instituted? It is because in a democracy like ours, where there is a very small possibility that the ruling party will be voted out of office, where they have a very large majority, the courts are one of the sites of struggle where opposition parties, groups, NGOs, etc., will attack the legislation and the policies of government. The task of the courts would be not to avoid something which could be regarded as political, but to avoid playing politics, to avoid siding with some or other party or faction or group. Now here it is interesting how this thing has been very politicized. For example, the best example is our Trump land, the United States of America. And it is also interesting that, you know, normally in the US, for example, those on the left are pro-choice and those on the right, so-called pro-life when it comes to abortion. But here it seems to be the opposite. Those on the left seems to be concerned about lives, saving lives, and the conservative side seems to be obsessed with the economy and the freedom of choice to wear a mask and to look pretty, and if you think you won't look pretty enough with your mask on like President Trump, then you have the right to choose, etc. Of course, this balancing, this weighing, this competition should not really be what is at stake, because it is just two sides of the same question. The government has to save lives by preventing people from getting sick and making sure there is enough medical equipment, but they must also assure that people can have jobs, have a livelihood, otherwise many will die. A strong economy, an economy cannot be strong with dead people and full hospitals. On the other hand, one cannot live if you don't have a job. So with that introduction, by the way, the question of weighing lives, even as we have it now with regard to beds and ventilators, etc., is a very old one in law. Jumping to our situation, the government chose not to use Section 37 on states of emergency, providing for the derogation of rights. Potentially, derogation of rights sound more serious than limitation, but I leave that for later discussion if anybody as ideas in that regard. The choice was made to use the Disaster Management Act. That means the Act gives the power to ministers to make regulations. And that means that rights are limited. Now, we all know that rights have to be limited because they compete. Rights compete. My right to freedom of movement competes with the right of everybody to safety and security, and therefore the government must limit my right to freedom of movement with rules of traffic. Speed restrictions, for example. I cannot drive at 300 km an hour in a Ferrari on the side of the road that I choose. That my freedom of movement can never go that far. So that brings us to the limitation clause, and I'm not going to read it out. It will take time. Section 36 of the Constitution. It basically says that rights can be limited by law of general application. So the president cannot limit rights, only law can. In terms of one or more constitutional court decisions, regulations in terms of an act are indeed law of general application. So if one attacks these regulations, you can either attack, like I think the DA at some point was doing or planning to do, you can attack the Disaster Management Act itself, perhaps for giving too much power to govern for too long by way of regulations, because this is not ideal. Or you can attack the regulations that they do not correspond with the Disaster Management Act. Or, of course, you can work on the very principle of limitation, and which brings us to the limitations. A limitation must be reasonable and justifiable in an open democratic society. That is the core. To help us to determine that, Section 36 gives us a number of factors to take into account. A very important one is, of course, which right is at stake. And here our experts on the specific cases can later tell me the cases on alcohol and smoking. Does it start with the idea that we have a right to smoke or to drink alcohol? I do not see that in the Constitution. Is that the right that is limited? Or are we working with a more indirect interpretation and saying that the truck driver who delivers the beer or the cigarettes is now without a job? He has a right to life. And therefore, when his livelihood is threatened because of an industry that could collapse, this is indeed a right issue. What I want to link to this is issues purely about the economy, the policy, etc. Those are not limitation of rights issues. Those could be issues which should, in a normal democracy, be determined at the ballot box and not necessarily by courts. But as I said, indirectly, a right can be implicated. The next thing is that we must be very clear as to what the purpose of the limitation is. That Section 36 tells us. And then, of course, the purpose of the legislation, of the limitation, must be linked to the limitation. Now, this is where the concept of rationality comes in. The Constitution does not mean to use the word rationality. And another word that the Constitution does not use, some other constitutions, like I saw yesterday, the Tunisian Constitution, actually uses the term proportionality. Proportionality means simply do not kill a fly with a sledgehammer. We'll come back to that. Rationality does not mean, if something is found to be irrational, it doesn't mean that the legislature or the president was insane. It means that there is no connection between the limitation and its purpose. To go back to my traffic example, if the purpose is road safety, a speed restriction of 120 seems to be eminently reasonable and justifiable. But a speed restriction of 5 kilometers an hour will not achieve the purpose of road safety. It will simply result in chaos. The courts developed this concept of rationality, and I think it is used a bit too widely. And it perhaps may give too much power to courts. But it is there, but I think one must be spared with how we use rationality. With regard to proportionality, I'm almost finished. The Constitution, specifically in section 36, the last one of those factors, E, says less restrictive means must be taken into account. It must be very clearly understood that the government does not have to choose the least restrictive means. If experts tell a court that road safety could be achieved by speed limits of 115, 120, 125, it is not for the court to say, well, the least restrictive one seems to be 125, that is the one you must choose. As long as the government chooses, the legislature chooses a reasonable option from a range of reasonable possibilities. The government, the court cannot sit and speculate on the difference between 120 and 125. It is, of course, important that whoever restricts the right, the government, must bring the necessary information to court. This was mentioned in the tobacco case. So I am actually done, except I want to use one or two examples. A very eminently reasonable justification is the limitation of free movement, free association, the right to practice religion by restriction on religious meetings. People make a big thing about your right to worship in groups and all of that. But it is very clear from the evidence available that groups, and especially church meetings where people perhaps get excited and sing and chant or whatever, could be a source for the virus to spread. Less clear would be smoking, for example, if there is clear evidence of transmission. But if we go back to the reasonable and justifiable in an open democratic society, I don't know, but I hear that in most democratic societies, this restriction does not exist. Last note on my side, one of the later speakers will address socioeconomic rights, and I'm not going to talk about this, but one of the, this thing also helps us, like the previous speaker says, to focus on what we have done so far, not only on what we should be doing. And when I personally saw in the first few weeks of these restrictions, how trucks deliver water and how hospital facilities are being set up with the involvement of the private sector like Volkswagen, one wonders why for all the previous years before the new constitution and since socioeconomic rights have been recognized in the constitution, rights to healthcare and water, why has this not happened before? Why does it only happen if there is an emergency? When people were told to wash their hands several times a day, some community said, but we don't even have water to drink. How must we wash our hands? The answer was, well, then use alcohol-based sanitizer. That sounds a bit like Marie Antoinette saying, let them eat cake. But we will come back to that. Thank you for the introduction. Sorry if I went over the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Justice van der Westhuizen. Really fascinating to listen to you speak. And I'm not going to try and summarize, but I think if there is something extremely pertinent that we should take away from what you said is really what the provisions in the constitutions are around rights that can be limited, but they must be defined by law. The limitations must be reasonable, justifiable, and that means that the purpose of the limitation needs to be made clear in terms of its rationality, the proportionality of it, and there must be a clear connection between a limitation of a right and its intended purpose. Using, of course, the restrictive means must be the least restrictive. And I think those are really pertinent questions for framing our conversation today. I'd like to turn now to Ms. Ampofo-Anti. So, we've heard the justice right now who's really laid the foundation from her. And you are sort of our scholar and practitioner. I'd like to ask if you could take us through some of the recent case law. We've heard a little bit about the cigarette judgment and some of the other ones that have been mentioned. There's been a lot in the news at the moment. You know, if you could just give us a couple of examples of how, you know, the courts have been handling some of these questions around limits of restrictions and this balancing of rights in terms of restrictions on rights and as well as realizing rights. What are some of the principles that have been applied and how have they been interpreting some of these salient questions? Over to you. I think you're on mute. Okay.
Am I audible now?
Yes.
Thanks. So I'm going to touch on just a few of the cases. I read in the media that on the 24th of June, Minister Dlamini Zuma appeared before the National Council of Provinces, and she was giving an update on what's been happening. And she mentioned at that briefing before the National Council of Provinces that government is facing about 90 or more legal challenges from various groups in different courts around the country around the lockdown regulations. So, I mean, that tells you just how many legal fires have erupted everywhere from the perspective of people wanting to challenge the various aspects of the lockdown. So obviously with various 90 cases on the scene, we're not going to be able to touch on too much, but I've got 3 examples that, time permitting, I want us to just talk about very briefly so that we can get a sense of how the courts have been dealing with some of these cases. The first case I'm going to touch on is the case of De Beer versus Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs. And that's the case that most of you would have heard about, especially if you follow the media, about where the lockdown regulations were declared unconstitutional in their entirety. That case was launched by a previously unknown NGO called Liberty Fighters Network. They basically said that the court should declare the national state of disaster itself unconstitutional, that the regulations must also be declared unconstitutional, and that gatherings must be allowed again, that all businesses and shops must be allowed to open. Now, this case, importantly, was launched at the point where we were still under level 4, so before we transitioned to level 5. So, of course, there were changes that happened even as the judgment was, you know, being written. We were transitioning from level 4 to 3. But the really salient point is how the court approached the issue of rationality here, because, you know, as Justice van der Westhuizen had mentioned, the assessment that the court is able to do under the principle of legality is whether or not a decision that has been taken by government is rational, which means, is there a link between the decision and the outcome that the government says the decision is supposed to give effect to. And that was what this case really centered on. Unfortunately, in this judgment, the court doesn't actually touch on constitutional rights and the limitation in any detailed kind of way. The court really just kind of in a throwaway line says that, you know, government's financial aid packages will not compensate people for their loss of dignity, freedom of movement, assembly, and association. But the court doesn't make any analysis or balancing exercise which demonstrates the thinking behind it. But what the court does do is that the court says, look, the principle of legality and which gives rise to the rationality analysis means that the government must come and tell us why these regulations are going to achieve the purpose that it says they're going to achieve, and why it's rational when you look at all of it. And unfortunately, in this case, the government didn't actually put up a proper explanation. The judgment indicates that, and I think honestly, this is extremely unfortunate, that the approach the government took in this case. But effectively, what the government says was the ends justifies the means. And in essence, the government's attitude in that case seemed to be, because of the fact that we've got COVID-19, it's an emergency. We need to save people's lives. We cannot put people's livelihoods or any of their other concerns above their right to life. We're trying to save lives, and therefore we're going to do what we think we need to do in order to save their lives. And of course, the judgment quite rightly said that that's ridiculous. The government doesn't have the power to decide to do whatever it thinks it needs to do to save people's lives. The government has to demonstrate that what it has decided to do to save people's lives balances all the rights, and more importantly, for the purposes of this judgment, is rational. And the court went on to look at a few examples of things which it said were irrational. For example, the court said, you can't visit a relative who's terminally ill with COVID-19 at the point in time when they would need your support and assistance. But when that person dies, 50 of their relatives can go and attend the funeral armed with their death certificate. And the court said that that wasn't rational. I think the court gave a number of other examples and ultimately declared that the entirety of the regulations were irrational after giving only a few examples. And you may have heard, some legal scholars and so forth have criticized this case on the basis that the approach that the court adopted was problematic, because the court didn't look at each and every single regulation in order to make a determination that each and every single one of them is irrational. Instead, the court gave a few examples of irrationality and used those examples to make the whole regulations or to declare the whole regulation irrational. And that's very difficult because you can't make a wholesale conclusion like that on rationality. Rationality requires an item-by-item analysis. I think, though, that the court's hands were to some degree tied by the very problematic attitude the government came into the case with, which was, again, not an attempt to justify every decision that it had made, but to simply say, look, I'm going to do what I think is best. And that, of course, badly argued cases often lead to bad decision-making and bad judgments. So the jury's still out on this case, and there's an appeal that's pending, and ultimately the SCA or the Constitutional Court will have to tell us what they think about this case, and hopefully we'll have more time to discuss the merits of this case once we get to the Q&A session. The second case that I want us to talk about as an example, because it speaks to the issue of socioeconomic rights, which I know other speakers will also touch on later. And it demonstrates yet another different approach of how government is approaching this matter, is the case relating to asylum seekers and special permit holders. And that's a case that was launched by an NGO called the Scalabrini Center of Cape Town. And the case was about the fact that the Minister of Social Development, pursuant to announcements that the National Command Council had made, that the government is going to give a special 350 Rand social relief of distress payment to all South Africans who are unemployed. The Minister of Social Development issued some regulations using her powers under law to do that. And unfortunately, she excluded from that anyone who is, or rather she included only South African citizens, permanent residents, and refugees. She didn't include people who are in the country seeking asylum. In other words, these are people who say they are refugees, but their refugee status is yet to be assessed and approved. And then there's also another group of people who are in the country from Lesotho, Zimbabwe, and Angola, who are all on special permits that the government has allowed people from those countries to have. So in other words, these are people who are all in the country legally, but yet they are excluded from the social relief that grant was going to provide. And the attitude that the government adopted here was that initially they opposed the case, and then they said they will abide by the decision of the courts. So they were basically going to sit back and wait for the court to tell them whether they were acting constitutionally or not. And the constitutional rights that were at issue here were Section 27(1)(c) of the Constitution, which says everyone has the right to social security if they can't support themselves, and that the state must take steps to progressively realize that right. There was also the issue of the rights to equality, and also the issue of the right to dignity, because we know, of course, that millions of South Africans and many individuals who are asylum seekers, and many of the people who are under these special permits from Lesotho, Zimbabwe, and Angola are people who are poor, and they survive in the informal economy, either running informal businesses or working in low-paying jobs, many of which were lost due to the lockdown, or impossible to perform due to the lockdown. And the government said, you know that these people are suffering. So what is the reason? Excuse me. So what is the reason for their exclusion? And instead of the court rather said, and the government, instead of coming forward and saying, oh, this is my reason, says, I abide by the decision of the court. So I find that approach to be also deeply problematic, because the court shouldn't have to instruct government about the appropriate balance of constitutional rights, and the fact that the fact that the government needs to look at the fact that these people are suffering, they're in the country lawfully, they are covered by Section 27 of the Constitution. They're covered by the right to dignity. Why do you then not take the appropriate steps? Why does an NGO have to take you to court whilst people continue to go hungry, and then you want to sit back and the court must instruct you on what to do? So I found that approach also problematic in that particular case. And ultimately, the court ordered that these individuals must be included. And then the last case I want to very quickly touch on is another one that has been very controversial, especially amongst people who are parents, which is the issue of the opening of schools. And the case there is the case that was brought by the former leader of the DA, Mmusi Maimane, has now started a new movement called the One South Africa Movement, and they launched a challenge where they challenged the opening of schools. But interestingly about this case, it wasn't just about the opening of schools. It was also a challenge against the move from level 4 to level 3 of the lockdown. So they wanted, contrary to what the Liberty Fighters Network wanted in the De Beer case, which is, don't put us under restrictions. The One South Africa movement was saying we need more severe restrictions. You can't move down to level 3, you must stay on level 4. So it also shows you the tension in society and how different groups are pushing for different outcomes, all using constitutional rights as the basis, different and opposing outcomes. So the One South Africa movement said, well, we've got the right to life, dignity, equality, bodily integrity, health, and the fundamental rights of children, including the principle in the Constitution that the best interest of the child must be primary in any issue relating to children. The One South Africa movement argued that moving from level 4 to 3 violates all of these rights, and opening schools also violates all of these rights. And in this case, the government took a very different approach to what it took in the Scalabrini case and the Liberty Fighters case. And it took what I would say is the correct and appropriate approach, where what it did is that it came with a very, very detailed justification and explanation, with affidavits from experts from the Medical Advisory Council that has been advising them, all sorts of different experts and information showing exactly why they took the decision to move from level 4 to 3. And in essence, what the government was saying was, yes, we want to protect South Africans, but we realize that we need to open up the economy because there are so many other rights that are being affected by the continued closure of the economy. And yes, we know we need to protect children, but we want to open schools because there are so many other things that get impacted when children can't go to school, like staying at home and being subjected to domestic violence, like not being able to participate in the school feeding scheme. So there was a very detailed and impressive response from government where they explained to the court why they did what they did. And ultimately, the court ruled in government's favor, disagreed with the One South African movement and said, look, we hear you on the issues you're raising, but the government has actually done a proper balancing. And even if you move away from simply balancing the competing interests and you look at a limitation on the various rights that the One South Africa movement is raising, it is a justifiable limitation. And I think one of the things that was really a nice takeout from this case is that the court pointed out that the right to life is not just a right to be alive in the biological sense, but it is also intertwined with the dignity of human beings. Both are central to a society in which each member of the community is recognized and treasured, and that the right to life includes the right to share in the experience of humanity, and that the stringent lockdown adopted to deal with COVID-19 was actually threatening these other aspects of the right to life. So I think that speaks to what Justice van der Westhuizen had mentioned about how the right to life is not just the right to continue breathing or not to be killed. It encompasses your ability to take care of your family, your ability to go outside and take a walk, your ability to be in community with others and so forth. And the government was trying to balance those things when it moved from level 3 to 4. And of course, it was also trying to balance all other rights of children by opening the school. So I think those 3 cases illustrate some of the things that the courts have been grappling with, how they've grappled with them, and also the varying approaches that government has taken in its attempts to explain to the courts why it's doing what it's doing. I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you so much. You know, fascinating really to hear you unpack those 3 cases, one on constitutionality, another one on extending special grants, social grants to asylum seekers, and others on special permit holders, and the third one on opening of schools and how government has responded to them in really different ways in terms of the issue of these limitations. I'd like to quickly move on because you know, I want to make sure that we have enough time for questions, and to really encourage our participants to, you know, start posing your questions as you're listening to our various panelists. If there are questions that come to mind, Okyerebea, there's already one that's been asking for a reference to the case on the asylum seekers and special permit holders. But before then, I would like to, before we get to our Q&A session, I would like to now hand it over to Commissioner Mir. You know, Commissioner Mir, you have been very much acutely engaged in the area of socioeconomic rights in your work as at the South African Human Rights Commission. You know, I'd really like to hear from you what the reality is on the ground. How should we be understanding the notion of balancing rights based on people's real lived experiences? And what is some of the challenges that you're encountering in your work at the South African Human Rights Commission, and as commissioner who's really responsible for socioeconomic rights? Commissioner Mir, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chair, and to your august panel, and to everybody, all protocol observed, especially to our justices, retired justices, and my former lecturer, Justice Johann van der Westhuizen in 1997. What he said today basically put me into a classroom setting back then. On the profound things that he said, they are basically playing itself out in society today. Be that as it may, so good morning to everybody. And I think from the Human Rights Commission, you know, getting the right balance and balancing the rights is basically where the South African Human Rights Commission comes squarely into the whole equation, especially around the lived realities that South Africans find themselves in the space here. And the reason why I say this for two or three reasons. One is it is benchmarked against a constitutional democracy with a progressive Bill of Rights and a justiciable socio-economic rights interest that is entrenched in the Bill of Rights itself. Now, and I'm going to benchmark this against 2 very important cases. The one case that I'm going to is the recent one on the 19th of June 2020, the Democratic Alliance versus the President of the Republic of South Africa and others, where the Freedom Fund came in as the Economic Freedom Fighters came in as the amicus or the interveners in that matter. But just to highlight the issue of the realities that the South African Human Rights Commission is now squarely faced with all the challenges that everybody has spoken around thus far. We come in from a perspective that the South African Human Rights Commission is a Chapter 9 institution. And in terms of Section 181(2), we have the independence to dispense with justice without fear, favor, and prejudice in performing our duties. And benchmarked against Section 184(3), which is, whether you look at it from the COVID-19 platform or outside the COVID-19 platform, I'd just like to read Section 184(3) of the Constitution. And that would say that if each year the South African government, the South African Human Rights Commission must require relevant organs of state to provide the Commission with information on the measures that they have taken towards the realization of rights in the Bill of Rights concerning housing, healthcare, food, water, social security, education, and environment. So that's basically the rights that are basically contested right now in the COVID-19 space that we talk about. Having said that, we want to then say to ourselves and the audience out here that in response to the pandemic, that the Human Rights Commission was also now confronted with this, with getting involved in a way that can find resolution to problems in a sustainable way, having regard to constitutional court cases, as well as developments that are happening outside that. And we operate within the framework of the South African Human Rights Commission Act 40 of 2013. Now, in response to, we all know it is right now that in response to, like Justice van der Westhuizen have said, that the government adopted measures under the Disaster Management Act and in an endeavor to balance, lives and livelihoods. Now, obviously, when we did that, the measures adopted have far-reaching consequences and have served to magnify and the glass of pre-existing socioeconomic challenges already besetting our country. And, and in the light of the fact that we are a constitutional democracy, government has been faced with constitutional challenges, as you heard, challenges seeking to impugn, among others, the legislation it relies on, to impose the lockdown, as well as regulations it has crafted in response to COVID-19. What has come out very clearly in this entire discourse is that it cannot be, it cannot be gainsaid that though it is an outbreak of the novel COVID-19 and its arrival in South Africa, it has sharply brought into focus the fissures of our society caused by race, gender, and other forms of egregious discrimination. And in the light of these huge disparities that exist in our country, the impact of coronavirus and the economic vicissitudes have been differently felt. It depends on who you are, where you stay, and what your lived experiences are. And I'll just give one shining example is where people live in Sandton and Morningside across the highway, and on the other side, people who live in Alexander Township. Now, this is where the Human Rights Commission squarely comes into the equation, because we are mandated to protect, promote, and advance and monitor the advancement of human rights. And we have been closely monitoring, involved in ensuring that the responses of the COVID-19 pandemic by the South African government are anchored in on human rights. And thus, the Commission carries out ongoing assessments and monitoring on the impact of human rights of the measures adopted by the state. Where it has noted discrepancies, it has engaged vigorously with government on many platforms at a very high level to bring this to the attention. From my perspective, I think I'd like to share about 8 points, Chairperson, and that is, the impact that COVID has brought around the issue of the 184.3 rights. It's around healthcare, housing, water and sanitation, gender-based violence, and the protection of the people with disabilities and vulnerable communities, food security and distribution of food parcels in a non-discriminatory way to everyone in need, be it national or non-national, and the observance of of health and safety protocols by the private stakeholders within a context of business and human rights. And then we also engage in the issue of police brutality, as well as the excesses, abuses of the South African National Defence Force as well. And what has recently come out in this whole COVID-19 experience for the Human Rights Commission, which is absolutely shocking, is the erosion of human rights and the impact of corruption and ethical leadership that Dr. Azam has alluded to early on. And hence we realize that we are 8 commissioners with 200 staff that are under lockdown at the moment, that have to look after the rights of 58 million people around the country. And without leveraging on our constitutional powers, in terms of section 13, 14, and 15 of the South African Human Rights Commission Act. Going into strategic collaborative partnerships with civil society organizations on the ground, human rights defenders, we're not going to get it right because we can't be anywhere and everywhere, and basically we are locked down. And we are, our total staff is 200 in this country. So against that background, I'm going to turn to the issues that have been raised by colleagues, and I just want to bring and highlight to the fore. On the issue of healthcare, the concern for the Human Rights Commission is that the growing number of healthcare workers who have been infected in the line of duty and the challenges around the availability of personal protective equipment. The Commission also noted that the healthcare services during the coronavirus has been hugely impacted, especially for people, poor and vulnerable people and communities with chronic conditions that struggle to get access to medication. And on the housing front, which is my portfolio at the Human Rights Commission, what we worried about at the moment is a question of evictions and homelessness. And this is a time when housing is at the forefront of the defense against the virus. And however, homelessness appears to have been given a short shrift. I will not say much on homelessness because we are being taken to court by the City of Cape Town right now. There's a case pending before the City of Cape Town. But I think having, this case landed in court as a result of the City of Cape Town refusing to allow those monitors that I spoke about from assisting the Human Rights Commission to access sites where there were concerns around social distancing, inadequate healthcare access, lack of food, water, and sanitation facilities, and allegations of sexual assault. And I'd like to stop there because the judgment is still pending there. So I would also then say a further concern is that despite a prohibition of evictions under the Disaster Management Act, evictions are still taking place around the country. And recently we witnessed an inhumane manner in which, again, and this is subject to another matter before the Western Cape High Court, of Mr. Bulelani Kolani from Kailicha, who was taken out of his shack by the anti-land invasion unit in broad daylight, under horrible circumstances that was totally against the grain of the dignity of human beings. Now, that matter is also before the courts. And so then I'd like to turn to water and sanitation. As Justice van der Westhuizen has also spoke about the issue of the water issues, it is not something new. It has been there for a long time, but the Commission, despite the efforts of the Commission recognizes the efforts of government to provide water through water tankering in certain parts of the country. But still, people still do not have access to water. And the Commission is on an ongoing basis engaging with the Department of Water and Sanitation to ensure that households are not left behind, because this is key to fighting the pandemic of coronavirus is water. So the Commission is particularly concerned about the gender impact of the lack of water and the risk attendant to the lack of adequate sanitation services around the country. Around the issue of gender-based violence, Chairperson, we know there is a spike in the violence, and we are working closely with the Commission for Gender Equality, which is also constitutionally mandated to deal with these kind of issues. Now, this also then impacts on the people with vulnerabilities and disabilities as well. And we as a Human Rights Commission are rallying around those human rights defenders that are working in that space so that we can leverage our constitutional powers to get to the corridors of powers, and engage the process. And I think we are relatively successful in that because we are engaging government at a very high level around these kind of issues as well. On the issue of food security and food distributions, we recognize that, that there are social relief methods such as food packages that have been rocked by corruption, where people who have been entrusted with dishing out this food are involved in stealing the food parcels as well. And this is basically what Dr. Azam has basically spoke about earlier on, the issue around ethical leadership and responsibilities for giving the beneficiaries who depend on this, especially that the economy is now on a meltdown. And so we have called on the Department of Social Development to basically take those officials to task who are doing these kind of things as well. And we're also ensuring that it must be, we've brought it to the attention of government that it must be done and it must be anchored on the non-discrimination principle. So anybody who lives in this country and it's on a basis of need should be getting those food parcels. Now, as far as the level of compliance is concerned, we are also worried from the Human Rights Commission on the private sector that are basically very casual about the pandemic itself and not adhering to the regulations. I mean, the point here is that we note with concern the low levels of compliance, especially by the private actors on health and safety protocols. So we call on business to adopt preventative measures to mitigate against the spread of the virus and human rights violations, and to also exercise human rights due diligence to ensure that the conduct does not contribute to the spreading of violence via the virus itself, nor violate human rights, And so we are engaging at that level, at high level, with the Department of Labor, to set protocols in place to see that adherence from the private sector. Now, what is very important for us as the Human Rights Commission, my last 2 points would be that during the period of lockdown, we noticed with the Commission has noted with extreme concern the cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment of civilians by members of the South African National Defence Force, as well as the South African Police Services. We have issued many media releases on this matter, reminding members of the police force and the Defence Force of their constitutional obligations to respect, protect, promote, and fulfill the rights in the Bill of Rights. And these obligations apply equally to private security industries like the Anti-Land Invasion Unit, like the Red Ants up here in the north, right? That when they are performing the quasi-law enforcement functions, including the removal of or evicting people on behalf of municipalities, the Bill of Rights is fundamental to be adhered to, and it cannot be moved away from. So we are holding municipalities liable for that in a profound way. And lastly, I would like to say that what has now come out very recently, and it is quite shocking for the Human Rights Commission, is the issue of corruption that's eroding into the Bill of Rights itself, because it's cancerous. I mean, we just saw a tender now in the Eastern Cape where they've given the Eastern Cape government has given a tender for the tablets for schools to the value of 400 million rand, when it was worth only 160 million rand, and we're reading it on a daily basis as well. These are the concerns of the Human Rights Commission within its powers to leverage the corridors of power to say that, in terms of Section 7.2, in terms of Section 7, we know that the Bill of Rights is a cornerstone of democracy, and it is binding on all three spheres of government and everybody, whether it's a private or the private sector or it's the state itself. Everybody is bound by the principles of the Bill of Rights that is founded upon freedom, dignity, and equality. In conclusion, I'd like to say that from our side, from the Human Rights Commission, as I said, we had to find new ways of dealing with situations, and we then did strategic collaborative partnerships with human rights defenders across the country to monitor both civil and political rights and the observance of that, as well as socio-economic rights as well. And having engaged the process in a very, very profound way, we are now reaching a level where we are having conversations with the leadership in government to ensure that at all times there is a respect for the rule of law as well as for the Bill of Rights in the space as well. And it's a learning curve for all of us as well. Thank you so much, Chairperson. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Mirmir. You've said so much, and it's very difficult to summarize, but I think what's vital is that you've underscored how the realization of socioeconomic rights is crucial to, in fact, addressing this microscopic virus that none of us can see, but has such a huge impact if we're not able to realize those rights, as well as dealing with this issue of saving lives and saving livelihoods. And I think one of the things that I really wanted to underscore is this whole issue about non-discrimination being non-negotiable under any circumstances. And of course, you've enumerated a lot of the challenges that are out there that perhaps we can pick up on during the Q&A. So now I'd like to turn it to our last esteemed panelist, who is Justice Yaqub, I've already introduced. I would really like to, close our panel really by asking if Justice Yaqub could help us really wrap our heads again around some of these very complex issues. I think what we have heard from the speakers thus far is about laying the foundation in terms of the normative constitutional standards around permissible limitations that must be defined by law. We've also heard about how the courts are contending with the claims of people who are making human rights demands and the duty of state to protect lives and livelihoods whilst imposing restrictions on rights that are permissible in the interest of public health. And now we have just heard from Commissioner Mir, who has also given us the real life experiences, if I can call it that, of people in this country who have really borne the brunt of persistent inequality. So how do we bring this together, Justice Yaqub? Have the courts adopted the right approach? What is the most appropriately, what would most appropriately be dealt with by the court vis-a-vis the legislature, or in fact, administrators on the whole? I think this is perhaps the final question that we haven't unpacked, and maybe you can help us, bring it together after really what has been a fascinating presentation by our previous esteemed panelists. Justice Yaqub, over to you.
Thank you very much. Let me see what I can do quickly. The first thing is that in the first place, it is not the job of the court to decide how to regulate society. It is the job of government to do so. It is the job of legislators to do so, and they have the responsibility to do it properly. I'll say a few things just now about how properly they are doing things. But if they don't do things properly, the courts are the last stop. Court cases take a long time. Court cases are difficult. And the trouble with court cases is that in these sorts of matters, there are very often differences of opinion between different judges and different courts about how to manage these things. And that is in the nature of how litigation goes, because no two people will agree on these things. And that's why I'm going to say, I'm not speaking as a judge today, I'm going to speak as a human being, and I'm going to say what I would take into account as a government, because the government must be the first to do the thing properly, and see whether I think the government's got this right. Not as a judge, but as a human being, taking into account the constitutional values. The most important thing is the context. We must accept that there has been a culture of corruption and looting by the ruling party and the government, which has gone on for 25 years unabated, which has resulted in whole-scale and deepening poverty, which has resulted in a miserable health system, which has resulted in a deepening of racism in terms of police conduct and army conduct, which has resulted in inefficiency at a very high level, which has resulted in the stealing of food parcels and a whole range of things. There's no point in throwing our cots out of our toys out of the cot for this and getting too upset about it, though it's difficult not to get upset, but we must accept that we are in a country which has been solidly messed up at virtually every level by the ruling party, and that is a factor measures are. Because if they had done their work even half as well as they should have done, the measures we would have had to take would have been very different. So let us accept as a reality that the situation is very difficult, created by the dishonesty, corruption, and so on of our government over many, many years, and at least we accept some sense of shame arising out of this. But let's accept that as a reality and say, right, now, what do we do? We've got this miserable situation. The first thing is to decide on what your objectives truly are and how you're going to achieve them. And at that level, there's a very important distinction that needs to be made, and that is a distinction between the primary objective and the secondary objective. The primary objective is not to close businesses. The primary objective is to ensure that people behave in a way which reduces the transmission of the virus. In other words, they keep their distances, They wear their masks as much as is possible, bearing in mind how difficult it is for poor people in deep rural areas to do these things properly. But the primary objective is the education of the people to ensure that they behave more responsibly, that masks are worn, that distances are kept, and they begin to understand how serious this whole thing is. Now, one of the ways to achieve this is to close business. It worked very well for the first 2 weeks when people began to be educated, but the closing of businesses and the stopping of activity is not the primary objective. It is a way in which to achieve the primary objective, which is to get the people to behave more responsibly. And in that sense, I would like to make a distinction between education and regulation. And I think the government hasn't got the balance right, because not enough of its resources are used towards education. They think that they can sit back and pass laws and talk a great deal about those laws and make lots of noises in public, threatening people and so on, thinking that these will be obeyed. So again, that balance is completely wrong. There is too little education in the process and too much coercion, too much talk of criminal conduct and so on. So we don't have the sophistication of explaining in a real and meaningful way to people how bad these things really are. And that is what the government should be doing, and that is what the government and our legislators have not done. But the second problem is that we've been confusing the two objectives of opening and closing businesses and the real thing. We've been using hammers instead of well-designed tools. You can't use a hammer to tighten a screw properly. You've got to use a proper screwdriver, which is properly organized and well-oiled and so on. And that's fundamentally the problem. And I'll give you a few examples of this. You can either stop selling alcohol altogether, says, we will sell alcohol, you educate people to buy responsibly, but you have your policing to make absolutely certain, and the rule must be that nobody must leave their home even with the slightest amount of liquor in their breath. So your enforcement is not closing of liquor. The true enforcement is proper police conduct in ensuring, but again, you see with the bribery and so on, it's easy to bribe the police, which is a bit of a trouble. But the answer really is to ban alcoholic conduct outside the home and try and create a culture where people drink at home. Really, the problem is that people are going to continue to get alcohol and drink anyway. So you don't solve that problem in a real and meaningful way. But I must emphasize that the true answer is not the closure of a business. The true answer is to regulate and affect and educate in relation to conduct. And that is where we've got the balance wrong. We're relying too much on regulation, we're relying too much on force, we're relying too much on don't do this and don't do that, instead of educating our people properly. And the alcohol ban is an interesting thing. The tobacco thing also is a problem, because you educate people not to smoke in public and to do things very carefully, instead of pushing people around. One of the problems that we have is that all the regulations are made as if we are people living, the majority of us live in a middle class and upper class society like you and me. The problem is that the majority of people live in such horrible conditions that all these regulations are actually meaningless to them. Their lives are at a much lower level. And I would have expected the government to sympathize with people at that level, not to use the whip, but to have a degree of sympathy for poor people, to have a degree of sympathy for where they find themselves and how things are going to be sorted, rather than to do it in the way in which they are doing it. One has to ensure that a government is non-racist, and our society continues to be racist in the sense that you will not get white people being killed by military people today. You get black people killed. That is the racism, that is the class distinction, which has been encouraged by our African National Congress, our political party, and our government. So we've got to stop the racism in many ways. So let me end by saying it's a very, very difficult situation. Education and not over-regulation, getting people to understand instead of threatening, understanding our society, and honing our tools very, very, very carefully. The example being, you want to stop people from behaving in a particular way outside their homes and getting them to stay at home and not closing businesses and stopping this and stopping that and so on. So we've got the balance wrong in the sense that we are over-regulating and not educating. Our regulation don't go to education. And we've got the balance wrong in the sense that we're not sharpening our tools properly and attacking the problem in the way in which it should be handled. We are using a hard hammer. And I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Justice Yaqub, for being extremely frank and honest about your reflections. I think it's been really, really helpful to get us started in terms of our Q&A session. I'd like to also thank all our panelists. I hope the participants will agree with me that it's been really fascinating to speak to them, and I almost feel like we would need a whole day to unpack some of these questions. So I would like to, I've already posted in the chat that people can start posing some of their questions. We'll do a combination of reading out some of the questions, and I'm just going to ask if, whilst I'm gathering all those chats, if we could have our next poll, which has already been posted. And the first question that we would like to pose to you is, has the South African government, generally speaking, struck the right balance in its response to COVID-19? A, yes, definitely. B, not quite. C, definitely not. D, I am not sure. The next question for our second poll is, do you think that in banning the sale of tobacco products, the South African government has struck the right balance between rights competing interests? Yes, definitely. B, not quite. C, definitely not. D, I am not sure. So again, there we're asking you just to choose one. And the third question that we have for you is, do you think that in banning the sale of alcohol, the South African government has struck the balance rights between competing interests? A, definitely, yes. B, not sure. C, definitely not. And D, I'm not sure. And our final question for you today is, do you think that in reopening schools, the South African government has struck the balance rights between competing interests? A, yes, definitely. B, not sure. C, definitely not. And D, I am not sure. So there you have it. We will post the results of this poll towards the end of the session, but please do take a couple of minutes to respond to our polling questions. So now I'd like to really just open it up for questions. I think I have a question here in the comment chat, so I'll just read that one out, and then if I notice a couple of people else wanting to take the floor, I will do a combination of questions. Depending on how many questions we have, we might do 2 rounds or so. We have about 30 minutes left for this session, so we'll try to stick to time. The first question that I'm picking up here is, how do we clean up this rot and shame, it says, as alluded to by Justice Yaqub, due to corruption, theft, dishonesty. We've seen theft of food parcels, theft of UIF monies meant for the poor, recent tender awarded to the presidency spokesperson. This is an indictment against the values of Mandela and our constitution. So that is just a broad question. Perhaps one of the panelists wants to take that, about how we really move forward in the spirit of leading like Mandela, which is bringing us into this conversation today. Perhaps I will give the floor to one of the colleagues who's already raised their hand. Sonny, you have a question that you would like to ask our panelists as well? I will take a couple of questions and then I will give it back to the panel.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. It's still morning where I am. My name is Sonny Onyebula. I'm working with OACHR in Liberia. Thank you to the panelists and to the organizers for very exciting conversations that we've had here for the last 1.5 hours. I went to school in South Africa. So when I studied, I did my doctorate in South Africa. So while there, I quite followed the impact and the influence of the courts in carving out how human rights should be enjoyed and respected, particularly economic, social, and cultural rights. So I'm not really surprised on the role that the courts are playing in this time, especially in expanding the jurisprudence. So my particular question is this. I want to know whether, taking into consideration that this has been going on for about 2 or 3 months, the civil society organizations, the National Human Rights Commission, and advocates have taken up quite a lot of matters, particularly the 3 that were mentioned in this discussion, to courts. So I want to know whether there are certain things that other countries in Africa, can learn from the pace-setting advocacy in South Africa and the role that the courts have played. Are there things that we can take back? Are there things that we are not done well that could have been done better? Because I think in all the countries I've seen in Africa, I think South Africa has set the pace in terms of using the courts to expand the rights, to limit government action and ensure that government applies the rules and policies in line with democracy and the rule of law. Thank you.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much, Sunny. I'm going to ask everybody just to stick literally to 1 minute, otherwise we won't have enough time. I see Kelvin. Kelvin, you would like to take the floor? And please pose your question, and if you could say your name and affiliation and keep it to 1 minute. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Calvin, I'm a HRD student. My question is for Justice Yacoub. I actually posted it in the chat box, but I'll just reread it. I agree with your stance of your solution, but given the sense of urgency of COVID-19, is your recommendation capable of meeting the urgent nature of the situation? Can we really educate 58 million people before we reach the peak of this pandemic, or before we are faced with its full wrath? Given the nature of education and the kind of span it takes to achieve your recommendation, is it capable of meeting the urgent nature of the pandemic?
Okay, thank you, Kelvin. And I think there was also a question earlier on about the Colin Koza case. I don't know if somebody wants to say something about how the courts, what that judgment, how the courts interpreted in that judgment. If anybody has some information on that, there seems to be some interest in that. So for the time being, maybe we will take those 3 questions. I don't know who wants to start. There was one specifically posed to Justice Yacoub, and then another one around what countries around the African continent can learn really from the experience in South Africa, whilst there are a number of challenges. In some ways is spearheading in terms of there being, justiciability of socioeconomic rights and demonstrating that the courts can engage in some of these issues. Okay, I think I'm hearing Mr. Azam. You want to take the floor?
Yes, thank you. Abigail, I just want to respond to the very first question. It was asked, so what do we do? What can be done? I think what is important is, if we look at the legacy of Nelson Mandela, it's about active citizenry, the power of what one person can do to impact the world. Okay, so it's very important for us we've stated this in the Freedom Charter, it's in the Constitution, that we need to uphold these values. And it begins with the self. So hence there needs to be a balance between the internal and external. We know that our leaders are the reflection of the consciousness of the people they serve. So what was the consciousness in the time of Nelson Mandela, and what has become of the consciousness of society in the age we live today? How do we promote those values? By holding ourselves accountable, firstly, be the change we want to see by acting ethically and provide an example. How do we take care of self and others? And so for one, it's very important, that aspect. And as the youth, they had to have the energy and the innovative ideas and the energy. How do we then support the youth to be more active in the governance of society and of the country? So I just wanted to mention that would be one aspect. And Nelson Mandela said sometimes we place a large focus on the external factors, but even more critical is the internal aspects of ourselves. And that is something that we can govern. It's how do we govern ourselves so that we can then inspire and bring about changes in the world outside. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Azam, for that and reminding us yet again. I was going to hand it to Justice Yaqub. Did you want to try and come back on this?
Yes, I will. I agree that education is a long-term process, but the concentration of education will achieve things even now much better than coercion. Coercion and criminalization, absent from proper education, will achieve much less even now. I agree we won't succeed completely. It's a long-term thing, but it's a question of emphasis. We've got to get into the habit of doing it, and we've got to do it now. And that is the approach we should adopt. We've been devoting very few resources to that. And the problem with criminalization is that we don't have enough police people to catch people doing the wrong thing. And that's why they keep doing them anyway. So I still maintain that criminalization doesn't help. We've got to get our attitude right completely. As far as the corruption and so on is concerned, that's related to me too, the broad question. Until the government admits that they have been corrupt and they have been miserable and they admit complete guilt, they will never be able to do anything about it. Until criminals plead guilty, until they do so, they cannot be trusted when they say they're going to improve. So that is part of my problem, that we have not reached a starting point yet where government and the ANC admit that they are absolutely criminally guilty. Until they do so, they will never come right.
Thank you, Justice. And echoing a bit of that sentiment, we have a participant who's agreeing with you and saying you cannot ultimately resolve a public health problem through regulation alone without voluntary behavior change. People will always find ways of evading regulation and can only change if convinced of what is in their best interest. So I think in many ways reiterating what you've just said. Who would like to come in? I think I was going to try and perhaps ask Okyerebea or any of the panelists really who would like to come in terms of countries that can learn from the South African experience on the continent, as well as the issue of the Colin Koza case.
Thank you. Can I come in? Perhaps?
Oh, thank you. Yes, Justice Westhuizen, please take the floor.
Yeah, I'll start with what other African countries can learn from us. I don't want to say that we are a shining example. As Judge Yaqub and others have pointed out, there are many, many shortcomings. But let us be slightly positive also, not COVID positive, but positive about our democracy. And that is, I have met many academics and judges from other African countries, and for that matter, from countries all over the world, who do admire the fact that we are a functioning constitutional democracy. I'm now not talking about actual service delivery. We know that is problematic, but the fact that the government can be taken to court in 90 cases or whatever, the fact that it is a pity that they don't argue these cases properly, as Okyerebea explained, but the mere fact that there is this provision and that courts are not closed down or whatever makes us different from not only some countries in Africa, but also democracies in Europe on the eastern side. So we do have a lot to be thankful for. May I also say something about the question? I don't know how to clean it up. The corruption, Judge Yakub is probably correct that the first step in any process of cleaning up is to be frank and to admit. But the education is a longer term thing. I don't think it is one thing to say, clean up all corruption, educate people to behave well, change our hearts, etc. But in the meantime, people are dying. And in the meantime, something has to be done by the government, who is responsible for law and for the observation of rights. And they cannot wait until people have been educated or corruption has been cleaned up before they do something. I take my colleague's point that even in what they do, there could be more resources on education than on enforcement, etc. By the way, if we then educate people, we must also educate them about the law that exists in any event, besides, and that has always existed in any civilized society, besides these regulations. And that is, for example, if I've tested positive and I know it, and I then walk the streets and go to church meetings or whatever, and somebody dies, and it can be proven that there is a causal link, then I'm guilty of murder. If nobody dies, then I can still be guilty of attempted murder. And if somebody dies and a family loses their breadwinner, I could be liable in the law of delict for a massive compensation. One or two small remarks and then I'm done. The end justifies the means. That is a very unfortunate slogan to use in this regard. Okyerebea, if that is what the government said, that is a great pity. It is a purely utilitarian concept, and it can be used to justify anything from terrorism to war. The question here in the limitation clause is, does it justify, not simply as a starting point, the end justifies the means? The very question to be answered is the one about justification. What I also gathered, just want to say again from the mention, sorry, this was not a question, but then I'm done. The mention of rationality. Rationality is not a concept that exists in the air. We cannot simply go to a court and say every second thing that the government does, let's see whether it's rational or not, meaning that would I have done it that way? Rationality must be considered within the specific context of section 36, 1 C to E of the Constitution. Last remark, Commissioner Armia mentioned section 184 of the Constitution requiring the Human Rights Commission to monitor socio-economic rights. Judge Yakub may remember at the Constitution drafting process, this idea, by the way, this proposal came from the circle of the Center for Human Rights, who was hosting this seminar, this proposal to include it in the Constitution. And at the time, there was considerable resistance from the ruling party to give the Human Rights Commission the power to check on socio-economic rights. And one of the arguments was that opposition parties and groups will use the Human Rights Commission to embarrass the government. I won't say anything more about that, but section 184 eventually they agreed, their representatives on the relevant committees, and the section was included, and it is now a job of the Human Rights Commission. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Justice van der Westhuizen. It's really inspiring to listen to you. I don't know, Commissioner Amir Okyerebea? Okay, right. Perhaps Okyerebea, I'll give you the floor first.
I just wanted to jump in there with just a few remarks. I think the one remark that I wanted to make was You know, just to confirm, you know, as Justice van der Westhuizen was asking, did they really use that term? And I think one of the somewhat amusing things in that judgment, on the De Beer judgment, is that they didn't actually say the ends justifies the means, but they said that the means justifies the ends. And when asked by the court whether that is indeed what they meant, their senior counsel insisted that he meant exactly what he was saying. So I mean, that's just a bit of a silly side point, but they were given the opportunity by the court to back away from that and insisted on it. And of course, as you've correctly pointed out, it completely defies the appropriate starting point that the Constitution requires. But I am concerned. And I think maybe this is one of the reasons why a lot of the people who've been voting on the poll say, you're not sure whether the right balance has been struck. Because on the one hand, you can see why certain things are happening. You can see the attempt to balance competing rights with, for example, the reopening of the economy and the quite cautious way in which the government has tried to do that. But on the other hand, they've got things which defy all rationality, like before we transitioned into level 3, where we were told exactly what kind of clothing we could buy and how that clothing must be combined, and so forth, which, where is the link between what kind of clothing you can buy and the spread of the virus? And so I think there's an inconsistency that comes out in the approach that the government has. You don't see this uniformity of government understanding what constitutional principles are, what the right starting point is, and how it must therefore permeate every single decision that they make. Sometimes you see them doing that, and at other times you see certain ministers, like the police minister, coming out and talking as if he thinks we are living in North Korea, and that his say-so will dictate the ambit of your rights because he can. And of course, that's not where we're living, and that's not what our constitutional democracy requires. So I do think that there's a patchiness in the government's approach, which is what leaves people with a sense of discomfort. And for example, the other things that we see where one is certainly as a citizen left feeling very worried is this issue of the brutality with which the lockdown was enforced. And I agree with what was raised by, I think it was Calvin earlier, that education will not necessarily solve the problem as urgently. But the difficulty for me is the resort to absolute force instead of an attempt to educate people, and where there's more emphasis placed on compliance than in telling you the reason why you have to comply. And to the point where even the people who are enforcing the law don't know what the law says or what it's about. So when we talk about education, even the people that are making the law and enforcing it don't seem to know what's going on. Because, for instance, in this past week, the Minister of Cooperative Governance, Dr. Dlamini Zuma, came out and said that people must report other people who they see with alcohol. Now, where do the regulations which she passed say that you are not allowed to drink alcohol? The regulations don't say that. The regulations say that you are not allowed to purchase alcohol, sell alcohol, transport alcohol, and those things. So when she says citizens must report others for drinking, what does she mean? And this is bearing in mind that this is the same government that presided over the murder of Collins Khoza in his home because he was drinking alcohol, which was also not illegal. So in fact, the SANDF and SAPS going into Collins Khoza's home and attacking him and others for drinking alcohol and accusing them of breaking the law when they weren't, actually underscores the point of education, and how its absence in this entire situation and the emphasis on enforcement actually creates an environment where constitutional rights are breached. So I do think that there's a lot more that the government needs to do to educate people, and a lot less on you must comply before because I say so. My final point is that I think one of the biggest things that this whole pandemic has exposed is exactly what Justice Yakub was talking about, which is that there are so many deficiencies in the state. And now we are dealing with a situation where there are so many deficiencies, and now you're in an emergency. And you can't necessarily put in place the right interventions because the system is already so broken. So in a normal country, you would expect that people should be told, look, rather don't do this and rather don't do that. But in our country, because there hasn't been proper interventions for all of this time, maybe the only way to do it is to say, I ban alcohol, because people are actually not in a position to use alcohol in the right way. Alcohol has been abused for decades without the appropriate intervention, and we're not going to fix that now. So the only option is a ban, which may come with a breach of rights. So I do think that it's exposing a lot of things, and that's what's causing so much discomfort actually amongst South Africans. That on the one hand, you know, the government is trying, but on the other hand, there's a bit of a mess that goes with it as well.
Yes, no, thanks, Okyerebea. That's really, you know, very, very pertinent what you've said. You can't fix problems in a crisis, essentially. And I just would like to pick up on some of the comments that are coming through to recognize that, you know, whilst in South Africa there are a number of problems, you know, the courts are not captured as in some of the other countries. So that is something that still should be applauded. I think we're basically nearing the end. I didn't see Commissioner Mir. Maybe you can reserve your comment for the closing if there's not a specific point that you wanted to come in right now. I'm going to give the floor to one more person who had a very long question in the chat. I think it's Elmian Duplace. If I could give you the floor, and then we will proceed to closing remarks. I think we're almost at the end of our time. So if you could pose your questions, and then we will try to capture an answer to your question as we do closing remarks. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, and thank you for the interesting discussion. I found myself saying yes quite a few times, especially with Justice Yakub. But my concern comes in, we deal with this, we throw around this idea of the rule of law quite a lot, right? So the rule of law is a value in Section 1C of the Constitution, and when people do go to court to argue the rule of law argument, the argument goes, you know, it's an issue of legality, these regulations, and then if we want to find out whether the state complies with the principle of legality that's part of the rule of law, they do a rationality test. So in some of these cases, and I say there in the comments, the beer, the Fita case about the cigarettes, the Isao cases, it seems that now we are reducing a concept like the rule of law, which is such a broad concept, to mere rationality. And that worries me. Because the rule of law is a very richer concept. It includes, for instance, that citizens must follow rules. It includes that rules must be clear, and we've just heard that, you know, sometimes the ministers seems to think what they say is the rules. We don't know what the rules are. We are on 1,500 pages of regulations at the moment. So that also speaks to the rule of law. And then linked to that is the idea that I get that the courts show quite a great deal of deference to the state. So as soon as that low hurdle of rationality is crossed, the court would say that's a decision of the state, which in a sense one can accept in emergency situations or disaster situations, because that's the way that the law works in these situations. But my concern is that this might become something that we keep after the disaster. So I posed this question in the comments to Justice van der Westhuizen, assuming that what I said is right. It might also be wrong. My question is whether this is appropriate in a disaster situation, and if this approach should be kept past COVID. This can obviously also go to Okyerebea, because she also spoke about the cases. So I would just like to know if we are now dealing with the rule of law as rationality. Thanks.
Okay, an important question, and I'll ask that you ponder upon that and reflect upon it in your closing remarks. Just before I turn it to each of the panelists to give their 1 minute reflections. Can we just pull up the poll results so we can see what the mood and the participants are in terms of the questions that we asked? Okay, so on the first question, has the government of South Africa, generally speaking, struck the right balance in response to COVID-19? We have 57%, which is a majority of participants that really feel that they're not quite sure. And in terms of the second question, do you think that in banning the sale of tobacco products, the South African government has struck the balance right between competing interests? There we have a clear definitely no, and then second place is not quite sure. So there we're clearly showing that there hasn't been a right balance in terms of the mood of the participants on the sale of tobacco products, generally speaking. And the third question, do you think that in banning the sale of alcohol, the South African government has struck the balance right between competing interests? And there again, we have a definitely no in the majority. And then, you know, in second place, I would say not quite sure. We have 36% who are not quite sure on that issue of the banning of the sale of alcohol. And then the fourth and last question, do you think that in reopening schools, the South African government has struck the balance right between competing interests? And there, the majority, 43%, say they are not quite sure. But a slight difference there, we have 29% that think yes, definitely, on the question of opening of schools. So I think it might be interesting for some of our panelists to give back in terms of what you're sensing from the mood. I think there is still, you know, varied views, uncertainty, perhaps, and demonstrating that it is in fact a very complex question that we have before us. So just would like to really, perhaps we can come back in the same order which we began. I will give the floor maybe to Justice van der Westhuizen. If you could just give in 1 minute what your closing thoughts, what is it that you really feel you want people to take away from the conversation today, and in taking inspiration from Nelson Mandela, which is the reason why we're having this conversation. Justice van der Westhuizen.
Thank you very much. First point is, based on what Justice Yacoub and several others said, it seems to be a question or a case of the chickens have come home to roost. In other words, after years of neglect and corruption, etc., but let's be soft and say after years of neglect, it is difficult to manage a situation like this with laws. Linked to that, some of the remarks by specific ministers seem to be indeed unfortunate. If it is correct that a minister said people must report neighbors whom they see drinking, that is very draconian, and that is what we heard from the last years of East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, where even family members in the same house would report each other for some or other reward. That kind of remark is completely unnecessary because, as Okyerebea said, the drinking is not illegal. However, let us on the other hand also be fair. The way I understood at least the president's explanation is the ban on the sale of alcohol, which is hopefully temporarily, otherwise it will amount to a crime against humanity, but is not to address all the disadvantages of drinking over many, many years. It is to keep hospital beds available. It is to, there are significant numbers of hospitals being overrun by people who are the victims of drinking, from stabbings and other incidents of violence to car accidents. So the idea is not to now for the first time say, oops, drinking is actually bad, let's do something about it. The idea is to, on a very urgent basis, try to make hospital beds available. That does not mean to say it may well be that what Justice Yaqub said is correct. You may not leave the house with alcohol in you, but that will also pose enforcements regarding, challenges regarding enforcement. Yeah, my last concern, or my last that I'm not sure of, is all these. I think we have to separate, are we talking law or are we talking politics and management in general? Of course, the two things are interlinked, but all these many problems, societal, poverty, corruption over years, the need for education, etc., cannot absolve the government from having to make specific rules for a particular situation. One must be careful, because in some countries, not only in Africa, dictators would even say, we cannot have elections this year because we have been in a mess so long. We don't have money for elections. I will continue to be your president for the next 10 years or until I think it is now time for elections, or we have the money or whatever. So things have to be done immediately. Those things, to come back to my starting point, must comply with the Constitution. I am not sure whether courts should take enforcement, economic problems, smuggling of cigarettes, etc., into account when they test the rationality of a specific regulation. Perhaps Okyerebea can tell us. But I think what we must all generally try to do is to keep, you're talking about Mr. Mandela and others, we must, number one, try to obey the law, not only those things that we agree with. And secondly, we must realize that we have rights and keep fighting for them. And thirdly, we must realize that everybody else has rights and that we have to stick to respecting the rights of others as well regarding every aspect of our behavior. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Justice van der Westhuizen. Really an honor to hear and have you with us today. I'd like to perhaps now give the floor to Okyerebea Ampofo-Anti. I think you were next in my order earlier. I think you're on mute.
Apologies.
Yeah.
I think I've made a lot of the remarks that I had wanted to make in summary already, but maybe just one more point in summary that I think is quite interesting coming out of the poll. I saw that 41% of people, I think it was, don't agree that the right balance has been struck around the alcohol ban. And it made me think once again about one of the themes that I think has come out on this discussion of the issue of education versus enforcement. And I think more broadly speaking, it also speaks to the issue of whether government is able to take the population along with it. And I think that given the nature of this crisis, it's so important that government takes us along with them in the journey of the decisions that are being made and whatever it is that South Africans are being asked to give up in the process, in the quest to protect society as a whole. And I think that, if we could all be taken along, we would probably have seen a lot less of these kinds of legal challenges and so forth, if we could all really understand the reasons why government takes the decisions that it takes. Because for example, one of the reports that I've seen on this alcohol issue, that just in the past 1 week since the ban on alcohol at the Helen Joseph Hospital, in their emergency department, one of the doctors there, obviously I haven't verified these facts, but this is reported in credible media sources, that in the past 1 week since the ban, they are down 100 assault admissions are down to 36, 200 car accident admissions are down to 20, 100 pedestrian accident admissions are down to 7. So that actually shows you, as Justice van der Westhuizen was pointing out, that the issue here is the admissions into hospital as a result of the alcohol ban. And we can see that the facts themselves don't seem to lie about the impact it has, but yet society is not on board. People don't agree and say, yay, we think that the government is doing the right thing. And I think we need to ask ourselves, why is that? Where is the gap between the government intentions, what they do, and whether society is able to be taken along on that journey? And I think there's a lot of work that we need to do in South Africa around that.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ampofo-Anti, for those reflections. Commissioner Mir, what should we take away? What should we learn from all of this in taking inspiration from Mandela? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. It teaches me, for me, it's about the power of one and the power to change. It teaches me about being a servant leader, and it teaches us to always do reflection like what we did on Madiba Day on the 18th of July. And I say that nothing is lost. We are all in a learning curve. And what I'd like to say is, in my opening statements, I referred to the case of the Democratic Alliance versus the President of the Republic of South Africa, where I quote from that case. It says, "What COVID has done, it has brought sharply into focus the fissures of our society caused by race, gender, and other forms of egregious discrimination. And in the light of the disparities that exist in our country, the impact of the coronavirus and economic vicissitudes have been differently felt." Now, this is in 2020. And so I want to reflect to what was said at the beginning when the Constitutional Court was established, when President of the Constitutional Court, Arthur Chaskelson, in his case, in the Subramani case, he reflected exactly on socio-economic rights, where he said, and I can quote on this, and he said, "We live in a society where there are great disparities in wealth. Millions of people are living in deplorable conditions and in great poverty. There is a high level of unemployment, inadequate social security, and many do not have access to clean water or adequate health services. These conditions already existed when the Constitution was adopted, and a commitment to address them and to transform our society into one in which there will be human dignity, freedom, and equality lies at the heart of our constitutional order. For as long as these conditions continue to exist, that aspiration will have a halo ring." Now, this is so pertinent to what we are saying and why we have like the Human Rights Commission that must play such an important role, especially the fact that now this year in 2020, we are also celebrating our 25th anniversary. And I would like to reflect on just another quotation, if I may be allowed, of what the late Chief Justice Ismail Mohammed said about the respect for the rule of law. And this is what he said. He said the respect for the rule of law is crucial for a defensible and durable civilization. Whatever be the parameters of any meaningful debate on the meaning of the rule of law and its relevance and application in modern society, it is clearly premised on certain fundamental foundations. What they said then is where the Human Rights Commission comes in. And I would like to say that because we are an A-accredited institution in terms of the Paris Principles, where we can speak truth to power independently without fear, without fear, favor, or prejudice, is to do a collaborative partnership with the national human rights organizations on the African continent, join hands with civil societies out there, and then become active, create that principles of active leadership to promote, justice through the Bill of Rights, through, freedom, dignity, and equality. I think I'll stop there, but was a great lesson for that we've learned, and there's, teaches us that we need to have more of these kind of conversations to keep our hopes alive. Because if Nelson Mandela could do it, he taught us that we can all do it as a collective as well. Thank you very much to the organizers for this.
Thank you, Commissioner Mir. And now, Justice Yaqub, what is your takeaway? What should we be taking inspiration as we deal with this very complex and critical matter that is before us, and taking inspiration from people like Nelson Mandela? What is your 1 minute takeaway?
I would like to say to everyone, please stop corruption now, because the problem is that our corruption and our stealing continues, and that is very important. It has very little to do with the law, although it has somewhat a great deal to do with the law. Then I want to ask two questions. First, would Nkosi Zuma have been better off saying, please don't act responsibly, please don't drink too much, please, this is a terrible time in our lives, instead of saying, report the people? Would our defense force people have been better off patrolling roads, making sure people don't drink too much outside and people don't behave violently, than by conveying the lesson to others by being violent themselves and encouraging violence in society? Would we have been better off policing more properly outside homes than killing off businesses altogether? These are the questions which we've got to think of very, very carefully. What is the right way? I still think we've got to continue with the process of education. The law has to encourage that process of education. And in that vein, I have to end on the note of practicing what I preach and plead with everyone to please, because our society is in absolute crisis. Each and every one of us must behave, that's the first step, must behave absolutely responsibly. Each and every one of us must not drink too much, must be very careful how we conduct our lives, wear our masks, look after poor people, and begin to recognize our own humanity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Justice Yaqub, and I hope the other panelists will really join me in really really thanking our esteemed panelists today for bringing us into a conversation about what it means to lead like Mandela. That is the challenge that was before us in entering this discussion today. I would also like to thank our participants. I think we have gone over time, so I'm just going to really try to bring the conversation to a close now. I would like to thank everybody for participating and challenging all of you, as Mr. Azam said at the very beginning, to become, active citizens and to lead like Mandela. It just took one man to become a global inspiration. And with that, I would like to thank the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria and all the technicians that have made this webinar possible, and the Leading Like Mandela Institute, as well as the Thembekile Mandela Foundation, for organizing this discussion and this Mandela Talk today. With that, I will say stay safe, stay healthy, and let us certainly take inspiration from the many giants that have recently passed, such as Andrew Mhlangeni, Zinzi Mandela, and of course the late civil rights icon, Congressman John Lewis, who said, there is work to be done. Let's go and fight a good fight. Leading like Mandela is a clarion call to all of you. I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.